Glory, and I'm really looking forward to getting around and painting these guys up. So expect a video of them. How often we are cursed by our previous words. Back in May when I said this, I'd assumed it'd be a relatively quick job to get them painted up, even before I went on holiday in June, and then be able to start playing them rather soon. However, said holiday occurred, lots of other things happened. If you want to know more, follow the blog for the ongoing shenanigans. And so it came around to July and I still hadn't painted any of the models. At which point, a friend of mine, who we had just finished playing Necromunda, turned to me and said, "Do you want to try something else?" And my response was to turn to the big box of models in the corner and go, "Let's try out Black Powder Red Earth 28mm. Of course, this was 3 weeks before the actual play date. We were quite busy, so we didn't want to be doing it every other week or anything similar, so 3 weeks seemed a reasonable timescale. And in my brain, I was like, yes, sure, I can paint these models in 3 weeks. What then happened was I painted 2 lots of Shirter in that time, and before suddenly realizing 4 days before I actually need to paint the whole box, and not just the small amount of forces I'd already done. This led to a rather crazy set of painting days, basically a Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and even on to the start of the day where the game was going to be played. But in the end, managed to get everything painted and based up and good to go. And we had a pretty good game, which I'm sure we'll cover at some point later on. This video, however, I'm going to talk about painting up these models, as well as sort of a second part to the previous post, where I discussed how these models look and how they assemble and go together. This one's going to be more about the paint schemes, as well as some final thoughts on what actually goes into making these models ready for the tabletop. Before we begin, let's talk about my painting standards. You may notice I am not exactly a Golden Demon winning painter. I'm very much focused on getting figures from the collection bench onto the tabletop, and the painting bit, although I spend my time doing it, is not exactly my favourite part. Because of this, my instructions on how I painted these figures might look a little bit different. Unlike many painters, I don't particularly do many highlights or other such patterns, as I don't use the triad system, which a lot of people focus on. Instead, I work very simply with an undercoat, a base coat, a wash, and then perhaps a semi-highlight or dry brush pass right at the end. For my undercoat, I always go with black. Black basically helps to give you shadows where you miss, but more importantly, on the upper surface, it's a very easy to spot where blacks may not have been painted over just yet, and you sort of have to go and touch up when you come back to finish off doing the base coats. I mentioned I do a wash layer. This is usually Agrax Earthshade on my Ultramoderns because it gives it a nice sepia tone. My painting style has been kind of compared to Gears of War or the early games from that period. But in other ranges, I have used sort of non-oil to provide sort of more a starker look when I'm wanting it, for example, for fantasy. And then the final part, as well as doing a return of the main base coat underneath, I will then dry brush Iraqi sand over most of my models. This helps to give them a sort of a dusty, lived-in look, but also helps with picking out details, for example, gun barrels or patterns on magazines that you may have missed before. Now let's talk about the figures themselves, and we'll begin with the Shirter. These are the guys, sort of the bulk of the figures in the packs. 3 different sculpts, and you've got 4 versions of each, and it does kind of lead a bit of veggies before the meat in terms of the painting experience of this box. That said, though, I complain, but actually there's quite a lot of nice detail on these figures. Even for what is effectively cannon fodder, which dies with no save roll, there is a lot of interesting little details that show them as part of this quite well-designed world. So, to begin with, they have the Gorka suits on. These weatherproof suits are actually really interesting, really cool designs, and will definitely help to make the characters stand out in them. So, I started off with Vallejo English uniform on top of the black undercoat. This sort of gives you that nice kind of greeny tan colour. And then on the reinforced sections, so the shoulders and the knee areas, or the lower leg, I then used Vallejo's olive drab. So that gives you a quite nice colour contrast between the main part of the figure and the different specified portions. On top of that, they then have a webbing set. I went for US Field Drab as a webbing belt with Russian uniform green pouches. Technically, I think the pouches and webbing should be the same colour, but what it does do is it gives a little bit more contrast, so it doesn't just turn into a collection of very dark colours on top of each other. Speaking of dark, for the black elements, such as the boots and the radio, as well as the non-metallic part of the weapon, I use Games Workshop Eshin Grey with a layer of contrast black over top. This is something I've picked up quite recently, and I really like doing now, is that rather than trying to paint a dark gunmetal, actually using contrast as if it was just a very, very pigment heavy wash has led to a rather cool look where you still maintain some of the colour underneath, but it then makes it look like it's black. This is something I also do with the metallic parts. So I use lead belcher on things like the gun barrel, the parts of the upper receiver. There's some other models, you'll see bits of metal everywhere. And this is done using Games Workshop's Lead Belcher with the contrast black over top of that as well. Finally, let's talk about flesh. So during the painting of these models, I used a variety of flesh tones, sort of experimenting on which ones I want to actually end up going with. So in the past, I've used Galler's medium flesh tone, which explains why everyone models look a little bit yellowy. It's something I want to fix and go back at some point. I have also used Cadian flesh, but I ended up decided because it's a relatively small area of flesh and you kind of wanted to pick out the wash quite heavily, I ended up using Iraqi sand, doing a very thin slit of the eyes, and then finished off with the Agrax wash over the top. On a few models, I've also used the Reichland flesh shade, so it sort of gives you a little bit of variety in the skin tones while still remaining the same basic colour. The other thing to mention is a lot of these guys have goggles, or at least one of the variations does, so I added on a quick orange for that, just to make them stand out from the red used on the Scorch guys. With the mountain of the shirt finished off, I finally moved on to their squad leaders, the Muttersib. Because of the fact that they have the same force, I decided to go with a very similar colour scheme for them. In fact, using the exact same colour scheme for the most part. The same Gorka, the same pouches, the same webbing, the same little tweaks to them to sort of make it look like they're part of the same unit. What I did differently was I used a different shade of grey when doing the black parts of the head. So effectively, the NVGs themselves are in the same Eshin grey I used with most of the black elements, but the actual focus points, or the rest of the head, like the balaclava, that's done in Dawnstone, which gives it a slightly different base colour, which means that you get a little bit of variety in the black when you're looking at the model, basically, which is kind of important because otherwise you end up with effectively 4 models looking pretty much the same because there's a lot of black elements. There's also another unit that's going to have a lot of black pieces, so I'd be very careful of, and you will see them when we cover the Scorch team later on. When painting of these guys, I actually had a really good time painting them because they have so much cool look to them. I think these are kind of a very iconic looking team, but is a very unique design you only really get with Black Powder Red Earth. The MVGs being on a Skull Crusher mount rather than mounted to the helmet sort of gives them this unique look. And it's quite fun to paint because you get a bit of extra texture effectively around the eyes because of the pads it sits on, which does sort of help to make the small patch of flesh you see in there kind of stand out a little bit more. So I definitely enjoyed these guys and would love to paint some more of them at some point when they get perhaps some more variants. Having done the local boys, it was now time to do the outside forces, beginning first with the Hongbin mercenaries and enabler to sort of bulk out the Awbari guard force. And because there's only 5 of them, and I was doing it first thing in the morning on a Monday. With the Hongbin, there's been some discussion of exactly what camo and gear they should be wearing. I decided to go with one of the suggestions which Token, one of the creators of BPRE, made. And that suggestion was to use the American Army old camouflage pattern. There's several reasons for this. 1, I've painted it before, and 2, it's a relatively fast and simple paint scheme that just requires sort of 2 colours and a wash. It's a green-grey for the basic colour, and then you sponge on your shanty bone to give it that sort of digital pattern before a little Norn oil sort of darkens it down to make it look slightly faded. On top of that, I added US Field Drab for the helmet and the plate carrier. It was quite cool. These guys, obviously, they're wearing a plate carrier and a belt, so you get 2 sets of that brighter colour against the camouflage. And then, as with all of the other models, anything black, Eshin grey, and black contrast. One thing to make these models stand out is the red scarf around their neck. This helps to identify them on the board and make them see more easily, but it also just pops. Your eyes are drawn to it and the orange lenses the enabler has on his glasses. Overall, with the Hongbin figures, I really enjoyed painting these guys up. I guess it's because it's a nice change from the Gorka suits. There's less dangling straps to have to hunt down and find, and a lot more just plate carrier and belt rig. I really like how the guys have different guns. They have AKs but with more attachments on them, so you get little bits of detail to pick out, both with the US Field Drab for the IR unit, but then also for the sights and the bipod and things like that. I think they also look really good alongside the Muttersib and Shirter. Having that different colour scheme just helps to stop them all blending into each other and looking exactly the same, which when you're going for camouflage patterns, it's very easy to make a force that just kind of, it's a bit hard to spot when you put them all next to each other because they're all the same colour. Having done all of the area guard, it's time to work on Scorch team. So Scorch has effectively 3 main areas when it comes to painting them. That is the jeans, the t-shirts, and then all the tactical gear. So for the jeans, I went with either Cantor blue or Calgar blue with a layer of Norn oil over top. This is kind of my go-to jeans-ish recipe. It's one of those places where you can leave a little bit of the base coat underneath it sort of helps sort of make them look like that mix of colours that you see on jeans. With the t-shirts, I was originally looking at how a lot of people have painted them, which is just red for everyone, which although very distinctive, might make it a little hard to work out which character's which on the tabletop. It doesn't help all the Scorch guys look very similar. You kind of have to be very knowledgeable about, like, well, this backpack is used for this type of guy, and this weapon optic setup is used for this class. What I ended up doing was I ended up going with a piece of advice that Token put up on the Ultramodern Discord, which is basically to use different color t-shirts which Echelon have produced as merchandise, and use that as effectively a starting point to build up your squads. So I went with Mephiston Red for the Advisor. So quite, well, I hate to say red, but basically a very reddy colour. He's supposed to be the only one wearing a proper red t-shirt. For the Automatic Rifleman and the Assaulters, I went with either Corn Red, which is actually the same colour I used for my Baroon Berets on my Paras, and then Dawnstone Grey in contrast. This then gives you sort of blacks and reds, and the black stands out just enough from web gear. For the Recce guys, I went with Russian Uniform Green or Dawnstone Grey, which then sort of gives you another set of colours for that class compared to the Assaulter. So when it comes to actually playing them, it was very easy to pick out, well, which colour's which, without them just looking like all the Recce's have one coloured t-shirt. After that, we went over tactical gear itself, which is black. Like, you know, when you look at these models, the helmet's black, the plague carrier is either black or multicam black, depending on how much you want to sit and paint those models out. In the end, I just went for plain black, and you was able to use the Eshin Grey and Dawnstone as the basic point to separate out the colours of different areas, so it didn't just look like I was painting the entire torso one colour when it came to figures with black t-shirts, for example. The contrast over top then goes on, and you can kind of go relatively thick with it, and it doesn't matter hugely, but in the end, it ends up looking pretty good. I was quite happy with it, especially once you hit it with that Iraqi Sand dry brush right at the end, just to sort of pick out all the edges. There's then some small details that just help to add little colours to the model. So I used Wildflesh Green on the glow sticks hanging from the belt. Not technically correct, but it's a bit standing more out than sort of clear plastic. I used Vallejo Green Grey for the ARC headphones, which we've got, or the headset, which then lets you have a little bit of a pop of colour on the helmet. And then finally, with the tan elements on the rifle, which is the PEC box, I then went with US Field Drab. Of course, you can't really paint the Scorch team without painting the red details on, because it's such a major part of the look of the comics. So I went with Evil Sun Scarlet on the glasses and little, like, tiny amounts on the lenses of the NVGs, just to give it that feel without looking too kind of overly graphic or comic style. Overall, really fun models to paint up, and by the time I was done with them, they didn't actually take a huge amount of time, although there is that very distressing part when you're partway through, where you've painted an entire model black with the undercoat, and then you base coat big chunks of it a grey shade, only to then make it look black again, which, although as ridiculous as it sounds, it does give you a quite nice look, like the blacks kind of pop and have a bit more depth to them. So, having painted all these models up and got them ready for tabletop with my base mix from Luke APS, what was my final thoughts? Well, one of the main things that came out when painting these models up is that I should have done a way better job on cleanup. There was quite a few places where I started finding mold lines, especially on the Scorch Assaulters running down the jeans, where I had to basically break out the sandpaper and sand that down those edges before I finished painting them. There's a few mold slips in places that, like, it's not enough to cause a problem, but for models when you're buying them at this price, you kind of would expect a bit more checking on the quality control just at the end. But maybe that's just me having found himself 3D printing and quality controlling his own stuff. I do, however, think that these are some of perhaps the best models I've had fun painting with. Because there's so much detail on them, it means that even when you paint entire areas a solid colour, hitting them with a wash and then a dry brush right at the end, it really picks out all the little elements and details that got into them, especially on things like the helmets of the Scorch team. You really see all the location for patches on the helmet sides, you see the wires for running to the night images at the front, you see all these little touches which you might not see on other models, and they're very well designed to be easily painted despite being packed full of detail. So for that, I am very happy with them. I think the poses are also really good. I would have liked to see more shirter poses, but that's just because when you're getting a force that's like a bulked out one, you kind of want to make everyone look a little bit different. It would have been nice maybe to see the modular elements be used to make them sort of swap out different parts, but again, it works very nicely, and at the end of the day, they're probably not on the board long enough to spot that actually two of them are the exact same model. But I think that this style is definitely one I'm excited to buy more of. I'm very much looking forward to November when the next expansion comes out with a few more additional models for each side. I've seen some of the previews and I'm very excited for them. In fact, if you look around the screen now, I've added a few elements, so you can see they're adding grenade launchers and they're adding the Elevoy's LMG. Definitely getting a bit more firepower on the board, which would be quite cool. But of course, having painted them up, I'm happy with how much I've spent on them. I would have preferred them to be a bit cleaner, but I think going forward, this is definitely models I can see myself playing with quite a lot, both for the board game, and maybe even just getting out for distinctive forces on the board with that. The size difference for me personally, as you can see here, isn't too bad at tabletop height. If I'm taking photos of them down lower, I might start to struggle a little bit and make them look a bit giant. But of course, now that's all done, I had to get some games on. And having finished basing them at around midday, I frantically got the models ready for after work, headed off to a friend's house, and managed to play a few rounds of Black Powder Red Earth 28mm. Which I'll cover in the next episode in this series. As much as I'm sure you're all interested to hear how the games actually went, I've whittled on long enough about in this episode. So next time we will cover a few details on the games themselves, as well as my first thoughts about having actually played the game now using the actual layouts rather than simply a few things roughly proxied. So for that reason, I will see you all around. Well, good fun painting video. It feels good to be back and uploading stuff onto this YouTube channel. Thanks again to all my Patreon supporters. It's been real nice to see people hanging out and chatting over on the Patreon about what's coming up next and do my update posts and see what I'm able to do. It's been fun to sort of move forward on this and come back to videoing and doing it a slightly different way, working off a rough script as opposed to just guessing it all. As always, don't forget to check on Char's blog as well to see the accompanying blog post. This one's quite useful because it has all of the things like paint lists and a few extra pictures and get a real nice shot of my finished painted models. And good news, the next video in this series is already in the planning stages. I actually have some of the footage and some of the rough stuff written down for it. So it shouldn't take as long before you see a new post on this channel. See you all around.